Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is to leave the paper as tabled. That is to say, you have it at your disposal. Further up. Is that better? Can everyone hear? Good. I don't want to read the paper. I'm allergic to reading papers. I break out in rashes, and others might break out in yawns. And hence, what I would like to do is to raise a number of issues that have occurred to me since coming here, and to try to make the material that I've tried to present in the paper perhaps a starting point for a series of conversations we can have in discussion about the relationship between the First World War and the end of the age of agriculture. And what I'd like to do is to simply start with the presumption that I've spent 40 years studying the subject. I can't presume that anyone else has been as unlucky as I have, and hence we need to know one reason why I would claim that the focus on Nagasaki and Hiroshima is both justified and incomplete, and that what happened in the course of the First World War was something monstrous, something that happened, I think, in 1916. I can explain to you why, in which both the meaning of battle, the nature of military life, and the institutions of war were transformed forever. And what happened on those fields of battle happened over a long period of time. A battle of 11 months had never happened, unbroken battle for 11, had never happened before in history, and it didn't happen subsequently. And that mutation of war into something no one had imagined it would be brought about a consequence which was highly unusual, and that is the dysgenic, in the language of the time, massacre of social elites, whose successor generation, the apprentices who were to take over power in military life, political life, economic affairs, on the land in particular, were destroyed. A social formation that had benefited from its particular privileged position over millennia found that war had devoured it. And here's a perfect instance of nemesis, that those individuals whose entire being, social being, and cultural life was based upon an institution of killing other people, wound up devouring its own. And I think in some respects this was a tragedy. In other respects, it is the precondition on which the new Europe of today has been built. The possibility for transforming international affairs into something in which war is a remote choice rather than a proximate choice began at that terrible moment. And what I want to do is to talk about this extraordinarily luminous evocation of loss which occurred while the war was going on and has never left Europe, never. It is an astonishing, I think, moment to look not just in the history of warfare, but in the history of art. And I want to present a number of instances where I would like to suggest that one of the most fundamental problems for artists of many different kinds over the last century has been the configuration of loss, the configuration of absence, what you call, Jeffrey, the empty spaces rather than the materialized forms. What is not there describes history in a way that it never did before. And the reason was the massacre. Now, massacre is, of course, built into history, but think of it in a different way. I want to introduce you to the fact that in 1914, a war broke out that was not the Great War. It was a war of 19th century proportions that got out of hand. And the reason it got out of hand is that it was fully industrialized and run by the great imperial powers that had the resources of the entire world at their disposal. So for the first time in history, something called total war, a word that came out in early 1915, appeared, and it had 5 different features. The first is it involved military participation on a scale the world had never seen before. There were 70 million men in uniform by 1917, 70 million. It's absolutely staggering. There had been wars that involved substantial numbers. We were talking last night, I think, about 250,000 individuals who were possibly going to take China. I mean, 250,000 individuals was a small holding force at the Battle of Verdun, where there were 2 million people on the battlefield. So we have a moment when there's a difference in degree that turns into a difference in kind. And it's not just that the numbers who were in uniform were never before seen, but so were the numbers of casualties. 9 million men were killed in the First World War. 1 out of 8 of all those who served were killed. And 1 out of 3 was wounded separately. Obviously, those wounded wound up getting killed too. But on balance, the rough order of magnitude is that half of those who put on uniform were casualties. That had never happened before, ever. And what it did was to fundamentally transform the age structure, the gender balance, the marriage market of Europe and a good deal of the world in ways that had enormous effects for the rest of the 20th century. Within that population of those who died, the lost generation, there is a curious anomaly. And the anomaly is that those who were higher up in the social scale had a better chance of getting their heads blown off than the men that they led. That feudal elites purchased their privileges through the sacrifice of blood, through the shedding of blood, a very old medieval idea. But it was because of the nature of siege warfare on an industrial scale in which the junior officers came from the privileged classes and they led from the front. They didn't lead from the back. So the First World War was dysgenic, quote unquote, in their position, in that those who ran it suffered the heaviest casualty rates. The differences are palpable. I taught at Cambridge University for many years. The British Army lost 1 in 8 of the men who served killed, 12%. Roughly 750,000 British men, 1 million men in the British Empire as a whole died in the First World War. That's 1 out of 8. In my college, Pembroke College, Cambridge, which were where the junior officers came from, 1 out of 3. 1 out of 3. So that meant you have a line, and you look to the right, and you look to your left, and one of you will be dead within 4 years. Now, this bloodletting was true in all armies. All armies of the First World War had what I would call a surfeit, a surplus of officer casualties, and sometimes staggeringly so, where the life expectancy of junior officers on the Western Front was perhaps 2 weeks. This went on for 4.5 years, 4 years plus, 52 months. And it is staggering why it went along, why it lasted that long. We might talk about it. But for my purposes, that enormous wound suffered by the hegemonic powers in the world, that enormous wound created a cultural form that has lasted to this day. And in many respects, since I've taught as an American in Britain and I've taught European history in the United States and elsewhere, this is the main difference between the United States and Europe. That the United States didn't suffer the injury of the First World War. And one reason why the political culture is different and why war making has been more possible in the United States than elsewhere is because of the First World War, which never happened in the United States. It had a short 18-month bloody nose. Roughly 100,000 American soldiers died in the war, and that was 3 days of casualties for the British Army on the Battle of the Somme, one battle, one single battle in 1916. That difference is just existential. It's just enormous. Now, in my paper, what I try to do is to talk about the concept of this loss as defining politically, culturally, socially, in many other ways. And I do so in terms of 3 different levels of meaning. The first is casualty rates within families. The lost generation was made up of people who did not have the good fortune, I say in the paper, to die one at a time. They died by the thousands. And they also died in armies where people joined up together. The Second World War is different. But the First World War, neighborhoods fought together. This is true in Canada as it was true in France. And so whole villages, as it were, lost their men when these great battles happened. And the telephone operator, people knew by noon if somebody lived or somebody died. It was much more information flowed back and forth than people realized. So the first definition of the lost generation is the 9 million men who died. And the consequences of that loss were really quite staggering in many, many different ways. For the purposes of our discussion, one of them was that it destroyed the succession of generations on the land. And in the British case, the one that's best documented, it produced the greatest change in landholding since the Henrician Reformation. Death duties had to be paid. Individuals weren't there to take on the estate. 1/3 of the landed property of Scotland changed hands between 1918 and 1921. It's just unbelievable. And these are the elites that provided the officer corps. These are the professional soldiers who had landed society, cavalry, horses, all of those old images of what war would be as their way of living, as their way of breathing and their way of thinking. And the naturalness of that order was absolutely destroyed in the course of 4 years. Now, we know there are a lot of other things that happened as a result of those losses. One of them, which I find most interesting, is a flight to the pagan perimeters of Christianity. There was a quite remarkable move towards finding out about the absent, and that meant spiritualism. Spiritualism was a very, very active social phenomenon at the time of the First World War, in part informed by those in, like Oliver Lodge in physics, who was prepared to suspend disbelief. If radio waves can move when we can't see them, and if you have the right receptor, you can turn them back into sound, why can't we imagine brain waves operating in certain ways too, that we just suspend disbelief? And there are an extraordinary number of Nobel Prize winners. Charles Richet, a French Nobel Prize winner of physiology, was exactly the same. And you can imagine why this happened. The reason it happened is that exactly like the destruction of the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center, exactly like that, 50% of those who died in the First World War were totally obliterated. They have no known graves. The same thing is true for those. There's no trace of 50% of the people who were killed in the World Trade Center. Not a single DNA trace. Well, the same thing was true for 9 million men in the First World War, and the reason was the artillery kept obliterating. What had been buried got unburied and then got unfragmented and, as it were, unpacked once more. So war was not just a killing field. It was a disappearing act. And because during the war so many men died and they were literally vanished without trace, the rituals of mourning could not necessarily carry on as they had been before. There was nowhere to go. In Britain and in France, and I don't think this is true in Germany, they ran out of black material for women's mourning clothes. They didn't have any left. There were no signifiers of loss. The churches, the conventional churches, had enormous trouble accommodating what I would call universal bereavement. And as a result of that, there were people who provided alternative answers. Theosophists, who were interested in Indian religion. Those who had, as it were, a wonderful art of chicanery and made a killing out of killing, made a fortune out of this. One great area is spirit photography, where double exposure could actually show individuals who showed up, who came to see. And the structure of a seance really was very simple. The structure of a seance were parents who had lost their children, the unnaturalness of burying your child or not being able to bury your child, who came together to hear someone speak through a woman, through a medium, speak through a woman, and hear the voice of the dead son saying, "I'm all right. I'm here with my mates. You can go back to your life again." That's what it's for. And the number of individuals who went this way is enormous. It had the most unusual mix of individuals. If you think about the ultimate rationalist, Sherlock Holmes, well, his creator, Arthur Conan Doyle, was one of the great figures of spiritualism. He lost his son. The other great individual is Rudyard Kipling, the poet of empire, who lost his son. I mean, the elites of these major combatant countries paid for their privileges and did so in such a way that the rituals of separation, of bereavement, of loss, and of going on with one's life were simply gone, completely obliterated. Now, of course, there are many other levels to talk about this one meaning of the lost generation. And the most important point, I think, for political history is that the age of those who led the democratic countries in the West went up by 10 to 15 years because the young generation that would have been their successors were dead. So you get older men. Now, whether older men are more conservative, I don't know, but there's a chance. There's a chance to say that those stuck in the old ways, think of Neville Chamberlain with his umbrella and his paper Peace in Our Time. Now, he lost 4 members of his family in the First World War, and he went on anyway. There are other instances we can speak about. In Russia and Germany, the opposite happened. The worst dictatorships of the 20th century were unthinkable without the First World War. Hitler was a child of the war. He couldn't have done anything without the First World War. Everything about him came out of that war and that defeat. And for Russia, I mean, most people whom I know who know about this in a way that I don't. Bolshevik revolution is unthinkable without the First World War. It's just impossible to imagine. So what I want to do is to say the lost generation first is a shock to the hegemonic powers of the world from which they have never recovered in one way or another. And that meaning of a lost generation, I want to argue, had substantial cultural echoes, significance, implications for our own day. The second meaning of the lost generation is curious, because the first one is egalitarian in many respects, that 9 million people, even though there were social elites who suffered more, there's still a tiny proportion. Armies were 4% officers, 96% men in the ranks. So even if you have a disproportionate number of officers killed, it doesn't matter. The army of the dead is the army of the nation. And there's no doubt about that. Well, in the 1920s and 30s, something else happened, which is that the story of the junior officers became literary icons. They became the canon. So that in some respects, inequality resurfaced in the interwar years to allow certain people to speak for the lost generation and others. And the vast majority of those who wrote were officers. And they wrote in certain ways about the death of their class. In Britain in particular, there's Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, which is, again, the ironic title. The title means the opposite of what it says. An iron is someone who says one thing and means another. Goodbye to all that means you could never say goodbye to that moment in life. There are many other instances I won't detain you with, but the second part of my paper is about the conversion of an egalitarian pall of mourning and universal bereavement into a narrative in which the junior officers are the carriers, as it were, of the tragedy. And in some respects, it turned into a very strange canon of writing about war, and it's sometimes called disillusionment literature. Maybe, maybe not. Irony is a word attached to it. And basically what it meant, and my old friend Ted Hughes, a great poet who's a fellow of my college in Cambridge, said that the First World War, when he grew up in the 1920s, was a defeat around whose neck somebody hung a victory medal. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The worst conceivable thing was to win this thing, because it was, in some sense, it had a victory, the word, had a taste as of ashes, from which you could never escape. Now that second moment produced all kinds of ironic juxtapositions, a kind of gallows humor that has moved into popular culture in Britain. I could see my children who grew up with this stuff that they read in grammar school, in public school and then in high school, all the poems, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, how fitting and noble it is to die for one's country. Those are words that are stupid, as it were. And what happened was that it got turned into real vernacular after the Second World War through the institutions of popular entertainment and comedy. And the way that it worked was through the radio. The BBC is at the heart of British life. And then television. There's a group of extraordinary men called The Goon Show on BBC Radio, led by Spike Milligan, a real lunatic, and the best use of that term, I think. A man who saw the insanity of the world as much, much richer than what was the war going on inside his own head. And he, together with Peter Sellers and others, performed a series of skits on the radio in the 1950s about how war is insane. Well, who listened to that? A group of people named Beyond the Fringe, Jonathan Miller, Peter Cook, Dudley Moore, Alan Bennett, and they created a second generation of insane soldiers. And who listened to them? John Cleese and Eric Idle and the Monty Python crew, who put together a series of insane visions of war that all go back to the Somme, to the battles of the First World War. One individual who used to be my neighbor, a man called Ben Elton, who's a comedian and writer, put together a 6-part romp through British history called Black Adder. And if I had thought ahead of time, I would have gotten it for you. So what it shows is the Battle of the Somme. There's 6 hours. The last one is the First World War. And someone comes to General Haig and says, with a sod in his hand, "This is the land that we took from the Germans on our last attack." And Somme said, and Haig said, "What's the scale?" He said, "This is the land we took from the Germans." And at the end of it, they're about to go over the top. Everybody's laughing, and the very last image is that they freeze. They are going over the top, and there is silence. The sacred is still attached to that moment. And France is just the same, and I'm going to try to show you the French and the German equivalents of this to show you that I'm not entirely Anglophiliac without any sense of other places. But the critical thing is to recognize how deep these cultural tropes are. And the third part of my paper is about the conversion of the ironic vision, the literary vision, into something that is now called traumatic memory. And that shell shock in the First World War is different from, but generically the base for the traumatic memory phenomenon that became legitimated through medical science in their therapeutic textbooks from 1980 on after the Vietnam War. Hence, I try to conclude the paper by saying that what the First World War was a bit like a series of events that simply won't go away. It's memory that cannot be put into history because it keeps getting reenacted. And reenactment is not remembering. It's a frightening return of a traumatic event. That, in a nutshell, is what my paper's about. Now, what I wanted to do is to take that for conversation with the rest of you and to say that one of the most powerful motifs of 20th century art, it's not unique by a long shot, is the configuration of the lost generation, of that loss. And it goes right through the 20th century, in that the catastrophe of the 20th century has provided artists of many different kinds with their moments of recognition, and indeed moments that come directly out of what I would call the authority of direct experience. This is very important. Millions of men came back who were there and who could speak about it. Frequently, they could only speak about it with other soldiers. And I want to show you, as a first installment of this effort to say that 20th century art has within its pantheon a group of men and women whose purpose is the configuration of loss. That is what the purpose of art is. And they move through the 20th century and across borders. And I want to show you some instances of that before reaching some tentative conclusions about the relevance to the project. That's what I want to do. The first one is a soldier who fought in the French Air Force, the son of the great painter Renoir. Now, Jean Renoir did a film in 1937 that's a work of genius. No one had any idea what it meant. No one to this day has any idea what the title means. He never told anyone. He would always have his sort of whimsical smile whenever anyone asked. And he did a film in 1937 about German prisoners of war. I believe this is the greatest war film ever made, which shows not a single battle scene. The indirection is the genius. It's what's not there that is the work of genius. It's what's off stage. The lost generation is not there, although it comes in a specific sense. These are French officers, again, the social formation that we're talking about, who are in prison camps run by other officers. And one of them, Erich von Stroheim, plays the ultimate German-Prussian officer. Raufenstein, just the name, Raufenstein. You can hear the barking of orders immediately. And he is a professional soldier who is part of this international elite. And what I want you to do is when you listen to the clips, there are two of them, is listen to the fact that he talks to his French officer colleague in whatever language is available. English when they talk about the Grand National in Liverpool, French when they talk about Fifi, who both of them tried to seduce at the same time in Paris, German when it's necessary, whatever. You know, this is a transnational elite. You know, everyone I know in economic history is persuaded that globalization happened before 1914. It was interrupted by the two world wars and has picked up again. But it certainly started with this international, this transnational elite and all the bankers and traders that went along with it. Now, here are two individuals who are professional soldiers who are fighting a total war. And total war means the conscription and promotion of every man into the elite, into the officer ranks. And this is the collision between Frederick the Great, Raufenstein, and the French Revolution, played by de Boieldieu. De Boieldieu is a French aristocrat just as effete and elegant as anyone. And the name means the god of the forest, Boieldieu. And that's Pan. Boieldieu, Pan. And what Pan does in the course of this play is to work out a diversionary trick to bring all the attention of the German jailers to him, this one aristocratic officer, who will go up on the roof of the castle where they're all imprisoned and distract attention so that the two everymen, one's a Jew and the other is a bicycle mechanic from Lyon, Jean Gabin, the great Humphrey Bogart, really, of French films, would escape from this impenetrable, impregnable fortress. So we have one man talking to another as a social equal, and we're going to see that scene in a minute. It is the officer, Rauffenstein, and his prisoner, de Boieldieu. And what they say to each other is, well, whatever the end of this war, whatever it will be the end of the Rauffensteins and the Boieldieux. That social formation is committing suicide. And one of them says, well, perhaps the world has no more need of us. And the other says, don't you find it's a pity? And the Frenchman, with a little sort of quizzical smile, says, peut-être, perhaps. The ambiguity, the irony is there. All right, we have that exchange in front of a geranium, the only, as it were, beautiful thing in the whole fortress, the only thing growing, the only thing of art. And then comes the escape. And we see Boieldieu on the roof, and you'll see he gets shot by Rauffenstein, who has an officer's duty to maintain. Now, what I'd like you to do is to just watch these two sketches. I think that's just before the one that I want. Tell me if you can get the sound right, because it's important to hear. No, keep going. There, now a little bit back. That's that exchange. A little bit there, right there. Watch their comportment, how they bow to fart. It's really quite extraordinary to watch the social conventions operating among the social elite. Yes. It's actually quite useful to know these things. Take a look. Oh dear. We did hear it. Well, back to the era before talkies. Okay, just keep it. This is the scene. They're preparing the escape. The rope. And you see again, the word of an officer is critical. You see the officer, de Boieldieu, takes it, puts it out the window. Why? So he can say, I have nothing contraband in my room. He can keep his word. See how elegant he is? He says, vous to my horse and vous to my wife. Thank you. Now that, to me, is the most extraordinary poem about the lost generation. And it baffled everyone. No one had any idea what it meant at the time. Humanizing Germans in 1937, presenting prejudice, anti-Semitism in the French army, all of the tensions. It was amazing. And in some respects, it has direct experience. Renoir told the story as something that he knew of, and it didn't show a single battle scene. It's indirection. It's about what isn't there. And just in the last moments I've got, I want to show just a couple of slides to indicate how others in sculpture in particular address this issue. And one is a woman named Katie Kollwitz. Let's see where her first one is. Yeah. This is a German artist. I want to suggest very importantly that women have the authority of direct experience. And this woman gave the blessing to her son to volunteer in 1914. And her son was killed within 5 weeks in Belgium. She spent 18 years trying to work out a sculptural memorial for him. 18 years. And slowly but surely, she realized the difficulty of doing it in a conventional way. And her representation of this particular moment took an extraordinary length of time. Can we see the next one? I'll show you what she did. This is herself on the right, on her knees, next to her husband, separate, not supporting each other, on his knees. In the cemetery where their son is buried in Rogevelde in Belgium, on their knees begging forgiveness from their children, this flock of children in front of them, for whom they gave no life other than war, other than death. It is not a religious statement. It's not accepting the will of God. It's a statement of personal responsibility on the part of the older generation for having given that life and that death to the millions of sons who lie in front of them. If you go a little bit further, I want to show you an alternative vision of that, this one. This is her own image on the sculpture. And what I found astonishing about it is, anybody knows that part of Belgium realizes it rains all the time, almost perhaps as much as here. And the curvature of the sculpture in granite provided an unbelievable sight the first time I saw it. This is 30 years ago. Perhaps the next one will show it. That sculpture actually weeps just because of the angle. Literally, the angle of her face provides something which she knew from wandering around that particular landscape, what her sculptures would do in space. And what they would do is they would take the precipitation and turn it into the lost generation. One more, please. There you see the difference. They're not holding each other. Notice that. It's very important. The couple do not support each other in their grief. He's almost Egyptian, she said. That's her wording of it. And the difficulty of the 18 years is to realize they are not supporting each other, that everyone facing this is facing it alone. Keep going. These are some of the models she tried to do, make him into the doctor that he was in Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin. Didn't quite work. It looked a little too religious for her. She took God out of it, which is, I think, one of the most important things. And there's the image that I wanted you to see. Unbelievable. I was just stunned. Never seen anything quite like it. Now, if we see other attempts to see what is missing, let's go to the next slide. This is Maya Lin Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And this, too, is a commentary on the First World War. Maya Lin was a student of architecture at Yale, and she did this as an undergraduate paper. Mind you, she got a B+ for it. The person who gave her that grade, whose name will remain unknown, also put in for the competition that she won. He got nowhere. Now, she got this from, and as you notice, it's the names. What matters are the names, the first meaning of the lost generation, just the names, the democratization of suffering. And she got it from a monument. Let's scroll down to see, not that one, the next one. No, keep going. No. All right, keep going back then. Can you? Oh, all right. It's the Tiefval. It's not on the list. No, it's not on the list. Well, you'll have to believe me. Just leave it. The Tiefval monument was done by a man named Edwin Lutyens. And what he shows, this is unfortunate because I wanted to speak directly to Jeffrey about this, is I'm sure it's on this on my card, but we can do it in discussion. The important point is Lutyens was the architect of empire in New Delhi. And he took literally the Roman triumphal arch, your Roman, rebuilding Rome. That's why I think we should put it up later. And he reduced it to nothing. What he did was to start off with a big Roman arch, and then he turned it 90 degrees, and he multiplied it by 2.5, 5 times 2. And when you do that, you make the void twice as big. So what you have is Roman arch, turned around 90 degrees, and on top of the 4 Roman arches are 2.5 times those Roman arch, with 2.5 times the void. And then he turned it another 90 degrees to make that void even bigger until you get to the top, in which there's absolutely nothing. He reduced the triumphal arch of Rome to nothing. What matters is what isn't there. It's not the physical or the brick. It's the emptiness. And as I said, I will try to put this up in conversation, or if you can get it up for me in conversation, we can do it. Now, there's another instance. That's the Kiefer. I wanted to use the Anselm Kiefer sculpture. Oh, by the way, the one on the left is the cenotaph in London, which is the empty tomb, nothing. It's about the people who had no grave. A cenotaph is not a Christian tomb. It's a Greek reference. It's going back before Rome to Greece to specify the lost generation, absence, and bring those dead bodies back, which is what Maya Lin did to the Vietnam veterans. Now, this one is an extraordinary sculpture called The Breaking of the Vessels by Anselm Kiefer. And I just wanted to leave this because I want to suggest that a great deal of the commentary and the aesthetic forms of dealing with the victims of the Holocaust derive from First World War notation. In other words, I'm trying to push you back to the First World War as the moment when the symbolic language of warfare became impossible to sustain. and a symbolic language of glory and honor. Now, this is an extraordinary replication of the Kristallnacht. You see those pieces of lead? They're a library being burned. And in front of it is the sign of the Kabbalistic zodiac. And in front you see the glass, the Kristallnacht. There's a whole sort of field of glass. Perhaps you've seen this before. This is in St. Louis. He has done it many different times. But what this is an attempt to deal with theodicy, with the biblical question, if God is all good, how does evil get into the world? And the Kabbalistic story has it that when the creation happened, God moved in such a way as to create the space for the universe and put the material of creating it in shards, in large vessels, the breaking of the vessels. And that material is what the Big Bang, what created the Big Bang. Now, in the course of it, the force of the divine is so great that they all smashed, and the fragments of glass or whatever in the vessels falling to earth are evil. That's how evil gets into the world, and it's the Kabbalistic idea. Here's an individual who takes history. You must see this in German history. This is a moment in eternity. He deals with what isn't there, literally the Holocaust, by showing two things. One, what did happen. There's an absolutely material historical reference in this. But he also shows what didn't happen, what isn't possible to see. And my claim is that what happens in war is so monstrous that it created a challenge to describe absence, to describe the extraordinary presence of voids in our lives as a result of mass warfare. This is what the names are in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and why it's so important. There are only the names. There's nothing else. There's no political notation. There's no question whether the war is justified or not. Only the names. The First World War created the lost generation of names, only names. In this case, the Holocaust is configured differently, but it is exactly in the same register of dealing indirectly with a specific historical event. And I would like to suggest that that's a counterpoint to the move towards abstraction in various kinds of sculptural work in the post-1945 period that has its own legitimacy. It has its own force. It's not the only answer. It's not the only way to do it. But it is one way of suggesting, to me anyway, that the world of the arts has been a very powerful pacifist vehicle for constructing a historical narrative about the 20th century in which war is the enemy, in which war is an abomination, and in which the only possible future. Kiefer was born a week after I was. He's 65 in 2 weeks' time. I'm 65 next week. In Dusseldorf, he knew of the bombing. He knew about the ugliness of the Nazi rule. He made history part of his subject. Now, that's not everybody's taste at all, but it is a direct and complete comment on this 30-year abomination. The two world wars, I believe someday will be one 30 years war. 30 years abomination, which brought to the end what you call the age of agriculture, which brought to the end that officer caste that the Boieldieu's and the Rauffensteins symbolized in Renoir's painting, and presented emptiness, literally the space between the lines in your sculptures up here. The spaces between are the spaces of art. Now, I'm speaking as an historian, and I realize this is supererogation to do so in your presence, Jeffrey, but I'd like to put to you that there really is a dialogue here. There really is a chance to use the material and extraordinarily beautiful environment that you've created to bring art and history together. That historians are waiting. You're pushing an open door in my direction. What we're not so sure about as historians is about the other way around. We don't have the sophistication of handling the art that you deal with. And we need to learn. But I would hope that this meeting could be the beginning of a long series of exchanges, and you will find that we have something to offer, something to say about the end of the age of agriculture that is inscribed in art as much as it is in documentary history. Maybe I'm stretching art to include cinema. I will do that. I will take that risk. Can you see how they're all burned, those individual? They're pieces of lead that are literally falling apart the way the libraries were in the Kristallnacht in Berlin and Munich, where the synagogues were burnt in November the 10th, 1938. It is a direct commentary on earlier art of war in Germany and indeed elsewhere, and I can refer to the notation if you want to. But I think it forms a unity that is very, very different from cultural formations elsewhere, perhaps in North America more generally. This is a different language. This is a different way of dealing with it. And I think the reason was it was a different wound. Canada had its terrible casualties in the First World War, where Dieppe was perhaps worse than the Second, but the truth is that Europe has a common past. I hate to call it a collective memory. You know I have troubles with that term. But it's a collective nightmare. And that, I believe, is the subject of much artistic and historical work, and only if we can find a way to speak together and work together do we have a chance of making sense of it. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. So, shall we start?
Yeah,
Are the mics on?
I would like to start, please. Thank you. Thank you, Jay. Yeah. And yes, I do look forward to doing future things together. Back in the 1980s, when I first discussed the idea of the end of the age of agriculture, and I recognized that the magnitude of the First World War was something that I would never be able to touch. I just could not gain any comprehension of it, mainly because of the scale and partly because of the distance from myself. Now, it had a very strong art historical base, at least prior to the war. The war was extraordinarily destructive to the blossoming art at that particular time. Franz Marc died in it. A number of artists died in it. Part of the thing that it destroyed among the modernists was the universality. They found themselves with their own belief in a universal change. I think there was a hope on the end of the century that there would be something very, very large and revolutionary happening among them, and including what was going on in Russia at the time. And prior to the revolution, there was a great deal going on in Russia on revolutionary art. The war turned out to be something terribly divisive for the Europeans within the main part of Europe. And something that's in Jay's work, which is not so much here, is a very important part of Jay's work that's missing in this presentation today, that we don't think about much now, that there was a total war as well on the Eastern Front. And we're so concentrated, probably because of our history, the Americans going in on the Western Front, the Canadians going in on the Western Front, the tradition from Europe itself being on the Western Front, that there's also a large story on the Eastern Front, which is not presented here. But that's part of the magnitude, and as Jay said, it had an enormous effect on the Russian world, and the Russian world and early modernist and pre-war art and leading up to the revolution was very, very important. The things that were going on in Russia, where Kandinsky was working at that particular point. The divisiveness that it did for the artists was absolutely a disaster, and out of that, which you haven't mentioned, is the growth of Dada, which was the artist's reaction to such a horrible statement of their futures being smashed, even though they may not have been participating in the war. So Dada, I have strong doubts about Duchamp because he came to America, and I believe he came to America, and you could clarify this. 3 of his brothers served. So I would guess that if 3 of your brothers served, the 4th son did not have to.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, so in coming to America, he had the privilege of coming to America. He was not part of that. What he did in America was so self-indulgent and did not discuss any of these things, that it led to a direct connection between post-war art and the pop artist. And there should be a very much more strongly position, in my opinion, on the question of Duchamp, mainly that he didn't serve, mainly that his brothers did serve, and mainly that he had the privilege of being in New York prior to the war, before Americans entering the war in 1917. So that's another historical thing which is a bit of a diversion here. For the artists that remained in Europe, the divisiveness was absolutely smashing. It was just something that, in its own way, appears to have destroyed modernism. I don't think that that's really what happened. I think some other things did happen out of that. So from an art historical point of view, the divisions that the war created were absolutely enormous, especially to people who considered themselves so clearly internationalists. So I say that's part of it as well. From my point of view, I never could have dealt with this, and I really thank you for doing it, because what I knew in coming to building the end of the age of agriculture, I will end up building it today from about 1450 on. That's when it begins. But it really culminates in the 20th century. And I knew that this destruction of in the 20th century, especially this suicide of the military caste, was the end. This was the beginning of the end. However, it doesn't end quite that way. The rise of militarism in Japan we haven't dealt with, which will become part of the Second World War. And when Japan came out of the shogunate in 1873, I think it was 1873, is that when the shogunate ended, Japanese militarism took on another aspect, and in an incredibly short period of time, Japanese industry was built up, and their war machine was built up. So this we haven't accounted for. And not accounting for that aspect of Asia, and probably in the vacuum of this particular thing, of the end of the British Empire, because that's exactly what they went to do. The militarism of Japan filled the vacuum left from the weaknesses of the British Empire left over from this. So what we really have, I knew it then, was a 30-year war. You've called it a 30-year war, and interestingly enough, in your book, so did DeCall call it a new 30-year war. So I've looked at that 20 years from that point as, if you look at it, it's almost exactly 20 years from the end of one war into the next. And that's how long it takes to rebuild cannon fodder, because there was another whole generation that had to come into being before you could go back at it again. So it never really ended. It just hit a respite at that particular point. And so it was going to continue. So the struggle to really end the age of agriculture will move from that point and the power of that point. Now, you're not going to be able to take 10,000 years of agriculture and end it in any nice way. That was exactly what I knew back then, and that it would take the most terrifying events to bring it about. And in its own way, you're beginning with the first terrifying event that has to be understood in terms of the terrible events that would come to bring that end about. The whole argument of the end of the age of agriculture for where we are now is we're living in a cultural lag, and we are living, luckily, in this cultural lag. Most of us from the 1960s never expected to live. You know, I mean, it was really, duck and cover was not going to do it. So thank you for doing this, because this really brings the magnitude. Your passion to this brings the magnitude to this that I can't do. As an artist, my passion has to be in the art itself. I can't be in this history, or I would never be able to do any work whatsoever. So I really appreciate that how you've taken this on, and how much you've written. And there are very many books that Jay has written. Every one of them is compelling that I've read. So I suggest that in the bibliography you find whatever you can. Right now, I think there's only 3 that you can immediately get from Amazon.com. So that's what I have to say. I would like to just open this up, but the thank you on this one is really very, very large from my point of view. Thank you.
Okay. So, yeah, Dr. Badash.
Quick factual type of questions. If the landed gentry sold off much of the estates, who were the new owners? Did Britain become an agricultural importer in the period thereafter? And who comprised the officer corps in the 20s and 30s in Britain?
The answer was Britain had been an importer from the 1850s on. Three-quarters of the British diet was imported in 1914, which is why they could not tolerate the German naval control over the English Channel. The First World War was a war between Britain and Germany for control of northwestern Europe. That's what it was about. And if Germany had controlled the food supply, it would have controlled the foreign policy. So that's the first point. The second point is that the the hard-faced men who did well out of the war, it's a phrase of Keynes, about the businessmen who ran the industrial production, chemicals, metalwork, shipbuilding, all of that, coal, they're the buyers. So there's a fusion of what can be described as a commercial and industrial elite and the old landed elite that had been separated in Britain. The culture of horses, you saw the horses on the wall of de Boieldieu's little part of his cell. That's very much a different form of a social formation and cultural formation. They merge. They merge, unfortunately, at the moment when the British economy starts its tailspin from which it's never fully recovered. The officer corps in the 1920s and 1930s are basically the survivors, the poorer individuals who were not as gifted as the ones who went over the top and got mown down. And the way the British Army behaved in many of the early battles of the Second World War showed it. Singapore is one example to choose the Japanese sector. So there's a recognition across the board that mechanization has to be made up for the loss of talent. You need machines because the men who could serve with brilliance were dead and couldn't conceivably make a difference. The feudal image, and this is a powerful one in Britain, transmits to the RAF, to the Air Corps. And they become the elite that saved the country in the second. So the same lost generation imagery attaches to the Second World War, but it's only superficial. What happened in the First World War was forever, and the country has never recovered from that wound. It's true in France. You walk anywhere in the French countryside, you'll find farming villages where they have war memorials where they have 60 names. And you see, 40 houses, and multiple family names, all there. An entire part of the future of France was eviscerated at the same time. The critical thing, in my view, is as I said, Jeffrey, the subject of loss is not an American or North American subject, nor a Japanese one for that matter, until later on, until Hiroshima made it so. And yet, it's so big, it's almost as if it becomes a metaphor for the decline of civilization as a whole, everything going to the dogs. The landed gentry represent metonymically that bigger process.
I have sort of a peripheral observation, really. Last year, I provided a short summary of my presentation yesterday, but I thought a bit about pop art and its emergence in the public consciousness in 1964, but sort of also provided some background on artists' responses to war in the modern period. And I'm sure you're aware of Goya's Los Caprichos and the Disasters of War. It's so interesting to me that he it's two sets of prints. He had been his political allegiance shifted several times. So he was a great supporter of the Spanish Enlightenment first, but then became really disillusioned, and then initially I think supported Napoleon, but then of course Napoleon invaded Spain and massacred defenseless people. So he came to the point of working totally alone by himself, doing maybe one of the first modern, early modernists do work that he didn't intend for anybody to see, just for his own personal satisfaction. So around 1800, he produced these series of prints on the disasters of war, and the underlying theme is that there's no death in a war like this, mechanized, innocent civilians up against a sort of machine-like army. Death serves no higher purpose, and he seems to be one of the first artists to really suggest that he just totally strips away all the previous associations with the glory of death and war. And it's so interesting to me that he sort of foreshadows in many ways a lot of what happens in World War I. He's really concerning. He shows Napoleonic troops as the 3rd of May, and it's just a sort of machine-like row, basically, of guns up against innocent people. And so I think that your point about maybe a need for historians and artists to work more closely together, well, I think this maybe drives home that point, actually, that we can sort of, well, I guess art historians might have some role in sort of establishing these interconnections across a sort of broader arc of history.
Just one footnote. I think I treat Goya with some ambivalence because I think the genius of much of the art of the two world wars is the art of direct experience of people who were there. I think Goya was a man troubled by torture, certainly the Inquisition, among other things, in a host of ways at a distance, at a remove from the set of events. Whereas the soldiers, including Renoir, who have an immediacy that they are speaking about their own world. On the other hand, what Goya does, and I didn't talk about, is the elision between war and civil war. There's a civil war he shows. It's not some, yes, there are individuals who were murdered by French soldiers, that's true, but at the same time it's a civil war, and the tortures and cruelties in Iraq come out of the fact that civil wars do that. They always do that. And they involve butchery and cruelty of the kind that we can say is very old. What I don't see in Goya is the machine war, is the industrialization. He couldn't, it was too soon. The industrialization of killing in an assembly line of mass death, an assembly line with no end to it. His is still one individual eviscerating another. And that, as horrifying as that is, in some ways I feel that the monstrousness of the battles of the First World War, the big ones, moved us into another register of anonymous murder, which, from my view, you see no Verdun, no Auschwitz. I just think it set the stage for the possibility of creating millions of victims through industrial process. That's the leap. But I take your point, and I think there's an awful lot that we need to do to restore conversation. Because, at Yale, it's not easy to work with plastic artists as historians. It's rare. I have one student who's done it. But this is exceptional. And I find it perverse that we're stuck in the same predicament and yet we don't talk to each other. I think the difficulties are on both sides, by the way. I'm not pointing fingers. But do you feel the dialogue is possible, then, do you?
There are some good examples, I think, yeah.
Hold on, Nancy wants to jump in.
I'm thinking about, lost generation in multiple terms, that when all of these young men were killed in World War I, of course, it means that procreation coming out of that is less, and there weren't any men to marry, so you don't have as many as the new generation. 20 years later, there's a lack of new generation, and it hits me on 2 points, that A, the British were able to do the RAF thing with very few young men coming out. But second, with the loss of this generation, I just always think, would Hitler, had there been these elite young men in Germany, would Hitler have been allowed to, would he have succeeded? I don't think he would have, but there was no opposition. There was no one to intellectually challenge him, so that the masses who were left kind of bought into all of this garbage that he was preaching. So on a couple of ways, you lost a lot.
Just briefly on that, the oddity of, and I find this perverse, but it's true, the oddity of all of the research I've done over many years indicates that despite the murderousness of the war, women found marriage partners to marry they wouldn't have married before the war
Yes.
anyway. So they married men who were the same age as they were, younger, because the older ones were dead. And they married across social boundaries, maybe with difficulty. The divorce rate goes up as much as the marriage rate.
Yeah.
But women chose to marry as opposed to being celibate, no matter what. And that meant that the population totals and the birth totals are higher than they should be, given the bloodletting. On the other issue, yes, it's true that the loss in the First World War was a subject of rage among young soldiers, the Freikorps, the freebooters, the adventurous men who liked killing, liked violence. But there were Germany lost 2 million men in the First World War and killed, and among that proportion were substantial numbers of professional officers, like the Rauffensteins, who had nothing in common with the rabble, with the Schweinerei of the Nazi movement.
Right.
Nothing. And this is a major comment among trade union leaders, that their men are dead. The young leaders to come, they're dead. I think it went across the board in some terrible ways. But the issue of who could have been around in order to present alternatives, you're absolutely right.
I was thinking about the current art scene, since you're also concerned about the present system.
Could you speak up?
Yes, I'm sorry. I think it's really interesting to consider who's producing art and who would produce art in response to war in the last 50 years. And since obviously in World War I and to some extent World War II, we have either officers or GIs providing poetry and literature and art, but especially in the United States, after the draft ends, up to the present, the makeup of the armed forces is completely different. And so I haven't really seen much art at all, maybe in blogs a little bit, in response to Iraq and Afghanistan in the present day. But there's very little visual art that addresses the experience of war or even the state of American life amidst of two wars. And also another point, this is sort of related in a way. I think the world of contemporary literature is beginning to be troubled by the fact that very little current work is rooted, current literary work is rooted in the world of work, which has been very important to modern literature. Well, so much new work coming out is rooted more in, say, personal autobiography and personal experience. But maybe the fine arts education system means that a current crop of writers has a completely different experience, separate from just familiar aspects of everyday work. So those are sort of two observations about the current art scene, and I wonder if you have any thoughts or comments.
To address one part of that, the first part of it, in the Second World War, much of the work that came out of it was novels. People who had directly experienced it. So I think of The Naked and the Dead, The Thin Red Line. These became sort of icons of American literature, as opposed to either paintings. A lot of the work that was done in the Second World War was illustration. Artists went in, they actually did camouflage work and other things. Artists actually went in and operated within those scopes. Jack Shadbolt had some drawings that came out of that particular time. They're very interesting. Colville was there, but they're just illustrations. They're not. They didn't do what I'm going to show here. I didn't show Goya, quite on purpose, though. I'd like to come back to that, because he was not a witness. He was a commentary. And the commentary part really is challengeable. I have a lot of my doubts. We saw those prints from Goya at the Metropolitan Museum sometime in the early 1990s in New York. And they are extraordinary. And they really do affect you. But in looking at his own history with it. I couldn't find his connection with actually having been in any of those situations. So that it was much more of a kind of almost cartoon commentary on it. I found that very disturbing.
Sort of social observation and awareness of it, and new sort of significance of death, or
Yeah,
maybe
but I found that very disturbing. So there's another approach that I have to it, which we'll show here, because I just didn't put them in. They were artistically very good examples of what I wanted to show, and I just couldn't do it because of that. So this literature in the Second World War is a very important part, much more so than the visual arts. So that part of the Second World War was definitely the great novel, the great American novel that came out of that, including Catch-22, are probably more significant.
I want to give Dr. Caste a chance to say something if he has something to say. Although,
I mean, well, I would like to thank Jay too. I mean, what it opens my eyes to is the fact that this process of the industrialization of war, which was eventually going to bring about the end of war as it was known, began earlier than in the Second World War. It's not as though I didn't believe that, but you've, in a sense, realized it for me. I can get a better feel for it. I mean, I think one of the things that happens is that in the older generation, there was the theory of a noble class, and the noble class was those people with whom you are honest. Those officers couldn't lie to each other. That was part of the honor code. If you had done that, that would have dishonored you, so he didn't lie. At the end of the war, I mean, in the earlier model of war, in some ways it's more horrible. We push buttons now and people die. In the 30 Years' War in Europe, people used to go through areas of Germany where they would see not a living thing. They would see neither people nor cattle nor fields. These were religious wars, and people would go up to each other and grab each other by the scruff of the neck and fight it out till they killed each other. That's something we don't do anymore, right? Now, we think in some ways it's better. We've professionalized everything. If you get sick, you'll be treated by a professional, and if you're tortured, you'll be tortured by a professional. I'm a professional. I'm a professional thinker, because you're too busy. You got things to do, so you pay me to do it. This has the result that in a modern war, you do not die with honor. You're reduced to an inconvenience. You are an insect. Those words were used in the Second World War. Right? This removes attractiveness for war in another dimension. It's not simply that the nuclear bomb will reach you or the weapons of mass destruction are something that you can't escape from, but your own honor in being involved in such a process has been sacrificed. Much better, as it were, to stand up to somebody else with whom you differ and fight to the death. There's honor in that. Right? And it agrees to some extent with our willingness to die for those we love. To simply be exterminated is an inconvenience. Takes something like the honor corps out of battle. And that's what I'm saying here. I mean, and the history goes back earlier. The Civil War was a war of an advanced industry directed against the old model. And the advanced industry won. Who can produce the fastest rifles, boots, bandages? And it has this effect. I suddenly see it. But thank you.
Are there anybody in the audience want? Okay. We'll knock it.
I just wondered, maybe you're going to address this afternoon or in the next lecture, but if you're not, when you said that the Great War was divisive for artists, I just wanted you to expand on that. If you're going to do it later, that's fine, but if you're not, can you tell me a little bit more about what you meant?
You'd have to look at the history of modernists at that particular time, who they were, what countries they came from, and their ideology of having a new set of design, sets of revolutionary aspects of the thing, and including architecture, which might or might not be a plus. We've talked about that before. Michael has addressed that at another time. For artists, it was the new world that they were creating, which was this escape from the prescriptive narrative that had been placed, that had lived for all of those years that they were required to in a sense, to meet before photography. So there was this great revolution that was coming of being able to think of art much liberated, much the way that music was liberated in the 18th century. So those people all communicated with each other. There was a time when the modernists all were just communicating, and they ended up on the German side, they ended up on the Russian side, they ended up on the French side, and the Belgium side, as a matter of fact. So there was a large number of them. You'd have to take a look at the history of art at that particular time. I can provide you some books and things. I didn't bring them today. I brought a lot of books to lay out on the tables this afternoon, though. They'll keep you busy.
I was wondering, Dr. Winter, if you could maybe comment a bit on the growing trend of transnationalization and what that really means for historians and for artists with counterinsurgency, growing piracy, the whole mafia rings, paramilitaries running parts of countries. Where is this sort of a blip on that we're going through now, or is it a growing trend?
If I can be heard, is that all right? Yeah, good. There's no doubt in my mind that the institutions of war mutate like viruses. I mentioned that last time, that it's not one thing but many things, and they change rapidly. And the concept of war being a transnational rather than national entity is what Al-Qaeda is all about. There's no question about the fact that we're not dealing with war anymore between national units in the same way as I think the conventional definition since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 had it. It's not even feudal wars. They're wars that involve networks that are very inchoate without responsibility or direction on them. So I don't believe this is a blip. I think the concept of war between nations is still possible. India-Pakistan is what we're going to hear about, I think, shortly. But that much more scary are the 5 or 6 wars going on in Colombia as we speak, in Latin America and South America. War is so protean that we really know very little about it in many cases. The second part of it, though, I think is that there's a fundamental difference between treating people who engage in things like the narco wars in Colombia as soldiers and as criminals. You see, there's a very interesting problem about Sheikh Khalid Mohammed, if he ever gets put on trial for the 9/11 crimes. Were they criminal or were they war crimes? My view is they were criminal because to use the same category of war for Al-Qaeda as we use for the Nazis is very difficult, and very, very difficult to sustain. The whole legal structure of responsibility, chain of command, all that. Maybe you can prove it, maybe not, but my guess is that the best way to treat international terrorism is as crime, like piracy. And in piracy, the international law has it that any nation can seize and detain criminals who are engaged in piracy anywhere in the world. I would have thought international terrorism would constitute criminality. Now, where does crime stop and war start? You see, that's my point. We're in a very, very vague area that nobody has a clue towards. And I think the more it's criminalized, the more these individuals are criminalized, the more clear-cut it will be when child soldiers in Africa engage in military operations to seize the diamonds and wherever it happens to be, where we can actually get our hands and say, yes, this is a war crime, that putting these young people that you've dealt with into these really infernal situations is a war crime. then we can make a distinction. But right now, I think, George Bush is guilty of many crimes, but he was responsible for the blurring of the boundaries. The war against terror is everything, and by being everything, it's nothing. The more international criminal court operations we have for crime, rather than war crimes in particular, understood as outcomes of war in the Goya sense of the term, that's my view. That's the better passage.
We have Dr. Foss.
It seems to me another thing that happened in the last century was the Nuremberg trials. And the Nuremberg trials had the effect of saying to the common soldier, the man who's required in order that a war can occur, that you do not have to obey your officers. Indeed, it may be illegal for you to obey your officers. A fellow by the name of Parker English, actually, a South Carolinian, who was a draft, served in the war, Vietnam War, a friend of mine, describes how he would go out and cite in coordinates. And as he was citing in coordinates one day, he began to realize that there were nuns and kids in front of the building, running around in the building he had just cited in for napalming. And as they came in and napalmed it, he realized that he had cited in the coordinates for an orphanage. He came out of that with a violent disposition against war, and he began to describe the number of things that were done by the people on the field to avoid conduct that they thought was immoral or illegal, and they thought of the Nuremberg trials. In Canada now, officers are taught that you cannot just simply obey orders. Every order has to be examined to see whether it is a legal order. So I see these as the first evidences of changing acts of war into simple acts of criminality. And I see this as part of the beginning of an international system of law. Now, I agree with you that war is protean, and I think that we would be fooling ourselves if we thought, well, we'll just do a little of this and do a little of that and it'll all be over. I suspect. But I think that transformation, and I was talking yesterday about international war crimes tribunals and so on, I think that's very important. And I think those of us who would like to see war come to an end should support these things. I think that the United States should cease its resistance to these things. I think the strict command, I still understand that the Marines march around saying, burning babies, I don't care. No. I think they should also be taught that there is a higher order and that you can't just do anything you want. You have to stand on higher moral grounds if you're going to take it upon yourself to exercise force of arms against other people. You can't just... Anyways, that seems to be at least a minimum, but I don't mean to shame your country or anything. That's just, I don't want to start a divisive narrative here. I'm just an observation. I would think that those people that would support the United States joining the convention, the International Court, and a number of other international bodies that it refuses to join are moving the world in the right direction.
Question, why has it mostly been a northern hemisphere that's involved in these great wars? Like you take Central America, South America, majority of Africa, they stayed out of the First and Second Wars, but they never really flourished during those times.
Two brief responses. They didn't stay out because they were part of the imperial networks that fought them. They did not have, they weren't in the line of damage, and destruction. That is true. But India was in the war. South Africa was certainly in both world wars, and a host of countries indirectly controlled by the British, by the Bank of England, Argentina. They were in Brazil. They were in the war. Yes, there are shifts, clear shifts, but the
small battles or surrenders.
The first point is a function of industrialization. The industrialized countries were the imperial powers, and they therefore could create a cornucopia of resources, all sort of feeding into the into the cutting edge, which was several fronts in Europe, in the European continent. In the Second World War, the Japanese were making their play for world mastery as well. But the atomic bomb, as we were talking, that was built to be dropped on the Nazis. That's what it was for. And the war in Europe was the one that was, I think, the primary strategic objective of the United States government, was to destroy the Nazi regime before getting to the Japanese one, is the way that it happened. So industrialization explains it to me, that the southern hemisphere has been less eviscerated by the institutions of war. But now that war is mutated into a whole range of things, and I think the field of action is unlimited. And that's what makes the nuclear proliferation issue we're going to come to so unbelievably dangerous.
Well, I think that with that, unless there are other burning questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Winter for that wonderful presentation, and also thank everyone for your questions. So please.